we're expanding Christie Park. It'll be down in the Christie Court area. That'll be about 360 units. We're also building about 50 units of intergenerational housing, so we'll be serving formerly homeless Tay youth and also formerly homeless seniors. So that'll be about 50. So what's the math on that, Wendy?
I don't know. What I am curious about, math-wise, I'm very bad at it, but how can you build that with 50 units?
So it's not just the building of the units, it's also investment in our below market rate home ownership program. There are a few different areas that we're spreading this money over, but to answer your question, by passing our bond, we also have accessed funding from both the federal and state government, and so we're able to layer all of that funding. So it's not just the 50 million alone, there's also investments that come in from other sources as well.
So if we're going to think about deterrence, I think one of the most robust findings from criminology is actually that bad actors are not really deterred by the severity of punishment, but by the likelihood of punishment. And if we apply that to discrimination cases, it kind of means that pooling our resources into doing like large class actions or the major enforcement actions is not going to have as much effect as basically guaranteeing help in all the small cases. That's going to move the needle in terms of discrimination much faster, because these class actions, they're almost like the death penalty of civil law. They're so infrequent and they take so long to process that it actually doesn't, I think, result in a lot of change from bad actors.
So it's more legal aid on the ground?
Legal aid on the ground for everyone who needs it. I think that's going to move the needle the fastest in terms of deterrence. And in this neighborhood, what we've tried to do is that. So we do a lot of areas of law, not just housing, but housing is about a third of all of our cases. And in this neighborhood, about 20% of the entire population has come to us for legal help, and we've represented about 5 to 10 families on every block.
Wow. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe,
No.
Nope. Kevin, you're passing down, you're going to talk about those class action lawsuits.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, look, I think a lot of things are true. I think I agree with all of the panelists. If you live in a condition of scarcity, and we do when it comes to housing, the people are fighting, right? And they're fighting, and that fighting falls along familiar lines sometimes. So increasing housing, making it more available means that single mom doesn't have to think about whether she's going to submit to sexual harassment because there's somewhere else for her to go. Or that voucher holder, there's somewhere else for them to go. So I do think that scarcity matters. It's also true that when our civil rights laws at a national level were passed in the 1960s, largely, there was a strand of thinking that said, now discrimination will go away. Because now people know that it's wrong and unlawful. LOL, we know that that's not what happened. And so to Adrian's point, there's also an incredible justice gap that frankly the legal profession has not solved. So I'm really interested in learning more about this model of providing kind of uniform legal services to anybody who needs them. We know what happens in eviction courts. When people have lawyers, they don't get evicted. When they don't have lawyers, they do get evicted, right? So we know that there is this justice gap. I do, however, think that there is value in big cases sometimes, particularly when brought on the part of the government, to send a message. Because what happens then is that all the landlords associations, all the realtors associations, they publish it in their newsletters, and it reaches people who have not been reached about this stuff. And I do think that it causes people to think twice. But the bottom line is, whether you're talking about a legal aid model of providing services to people who need it, who walk in the door, or a kind of impact litigation model of bringing big cases, the laws don't enforce themselves, right? They require vigorous enforcement at every level, or they are meaningless. And laws are promises, right? Laws are promises that we have made to ourselves about what we will and won't accept in our society. And when we don't enforce them, we're breaking that promise to all of us.
You know what, we're gonna take questions at the end, but right now I'm gonna go ahead and ask a few other questions, and at the end, we have time for. So where do you see government agencies and nonprofits miss the mark in terms of rental relief? Logan, this is sort of
Yeah. I think, and this is the biggest thing that I'm proud of, because it's not common. And specifically, I'm talking about targeted prevention. I think that the idea of prevention can mean different things to different people. And often, same thing that we saw with like the COVID relief money, the people that might not need it the most are the ones that get it. So when I think about prevention, I think often nonprofits, if they do have a prevention component to it, they have kind of like a first come, first served approach. But first come, first served doesn't take into consideration those that might be on the other side of that digital equity gap. Not everybody has access to computers or smartphones. Not everybody has all the documentation necessary. Some people don't have their name on a lease. Some people are in different types of housing situations that really aren't the best for really high barrier programs and trying to get in. So I think a targeted prevention method kind of counteracts that, and it's also about prioritizing all of those gaps. So when we're talking about folks that don't have documentation, don't have their name on a lease, that's a prioritization point, because someone in that situation doesn't have the protections as someone that is on a lease. So, that's the biggest pitfall that I've seen.
Do any others want to comment on this, or otherwise I have a related question? Where do we miss the mark on renovation?
I mean, Logan pretty much summed everything up, but I think from the government standpoint, it's being proactive and actually doing ongoing assessments of how your programming is actually working. Government can be slow. In Emeryville, I feel like we're very efficient, but it is still the government. And so I think sometimes the government plays into its own narrative about taking its time and not being as efficient because people expect that. Sometimes there's not always a motivation to be more efficient, because it's like, why do we need to do better if people already just get it? And so the government taking a look at itself in general across the board in so many other areas, but specifically around rental relief, what are we doing where we can be more efficient? And then programming with organizations that understand how to address gaps and how to be more flexible, so you can help the people who are the most vulnerable, have the highest needs, have the highest barriers, because the government is not actually set up to help people who are struggling like that. You think about every single time you're going to the government for something, whether it's the DMV or just anything, you're applying for any type of programming, there's their documentation is absolutely needed. Driver's licenses, any type of identification is absolutely needed. It's very stringent. And so, but if the government is supposed to be in service of the people, if we're missing people because we're being too stringent, we have to look ourselves in the face and say, how can we be more flexible? Yes, we want to make sure that there's a level of oversight, that there's not a level of abuse, and it's going to the right people, but we know it's not going to the right people if we're not allowing ourselves to be flexible.
Well, first off, I love rental assistance. I do think that if we're thinking about prevention, legal assistance is sort of like by far more cost effective at reducing homelessness, and really should be thought of as kind of like a baseline before any financial subsidies. And so an example of this is, I have a sort of recent client, but it's kind of a good example. He worked as a painter, he wasn't paid his wages, he would be given checks and then he could not deposit them due to insufficient funds. He had his dental insurance sort of taken away, but the employer still deducted the premiums for it. He had his PTO, which is kind of an accrued wage cut without explanation. He was injured twice on the job, but the employer would sort of lie to prevent him from getting workers' comp. And then when he complained about it, he was fired. And when he was fired, they claimed in his sort of termination sheet that he was fired because he would refuse to take required rest breaks, which was a lie. And because this is a kind of firing for cause, he was denied unemployment insurance. And because of all of this, he ended up homeless and in a shelter in San Francisco. And it's just kind of crazy from a policy perspective that we would not provide legal assistance for him. We don't really fund individual legal assistance for workers in this kind of situation, but we do provide sort of rental assistance and financial assistance. That's just sort of like an example.
Related to that, let me ask you, any of you who want to comment on this. How do you get people out of a place where they're having to come back constantly to ask for that rental assistance? I mean, I know I'm asking you to solve the great deal, inequity gap, but I know you can do it.
I can't say that it's not a challenge going up against so many different broken systems at the same time, really, because that's what kind of homelessness is. It's this amalgamation of multiple broken systems that you're up against. So there's no silver bullet that can really address all things. With that said, we do try our best to think about what interventions are needed. I think a recent example was, we get pretty good. Again, it's like we have vocational support, legal aid support, and housemate matching and all that good stuff. But sometimes you'll end up in a situation where, let's say recently, there was a single mother, 3 kids, couldn't afford any childcare. And the rent burden, and when I say rent burden, it's what is it? Rent divided by income. So if your rent is $1,500 and your income is $2,000, that's a 75% rent burden. So, this is someone that had like a 90% rent burden, and it's like, what do you do here? And we're doing case conferencing, trying to figure it out. And at some point you're like, okay, there's not really something that we can offer right now that solves this. So immediately, once I kind of got to that point, and I'm thinking about other resources, I say, you know what, let me actually go to a funder, and I'm gonna have that conversation next week. But I'm gonna go to this funder and say, this is what we're seeing, I already have the proposal drafted, and I wanna have a shallow subsidy program that supports this person with their child care, not just this person, but this profile of person. Because this isn't the only time that we see things like this. So really, I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to nonprofits. Like, if you do see a gap, instead of trying to figure out how to make the broken system work, you just have to improve the system to the best of your ability.
What do you mean by a shallow subsidy?
So a shallow subsidy is a subsidy so a deep subsidy is Section 8. It covers most of the rent. A shallow subsidy gets the rent burden down to 50%, which is a little bit more manageable. It's still temporary, 12 to 18 months, but during that time, we could talk about how to get you into a job, for example, where you make enough to afford childcare and rent. So it's just things like that, but we just have to figure out how to make it work, but at least we need to buy the time to make it work. Because sometimes, trying to do this in a one-time fashion, it just isn't enough because it's a little bit more complicated than that. So we already did it recently with transitional age youth in East Oakland, part of the Rise East initiative. We actually shout out to the funder. I don't know if it's supposed to be anonymous until we get our evaluation results, but they just gave us funding for a shallow subsidy, working with transitional age youth. And it's because what we started seeing with the data, transitional age youth actually had about $1,100 more on average than everybody else in terms of the support that they needed. So when we're seeing a $5,600 average for everybody, but then transitional age youth between the ages of 18 and 24 are seeing more like $7,800, or $6,800, sorry. But it was just so much that it was just like, okay, we need a subsidy program for this group too, because this is obviously this is a cohort of people that are disproportionately affected compared to everybody else.
We're running out of time, and I apologize. We're running out of time, but I want to give each of you just a minute or so to kind of sum up. If you want to sum up, just closing statements or anything you kind of want to
Oh, sure. No, let me say this about civil rights. You know, something that I've been reflecting on as we're talking, and some of Adrian's comments made me think about it, is like, we started out talking, you know, Wendy's introduction was we're the biggest state civil rights agency in the country. That is true. We are bigger than any other state civil rights agency in the country. We have about 30 fair housing investigators. Our state is nearly 40 million people. There is no way that government alone, in its current structure, is going to end discrimination, period. The legal profession has not found a way yet, maybe we're working on it, to provide the legal services that people need. And so it is not just like, we're all civil rights workers, right? Every single one of us in our daily lives. Maybe we're employees, maybe we're employers, we're landlords, we're tenants. We rely on each other to keep these promises that we make to ourselves. Maybe you're in HR, I don't know. But wherever you are, I promise you, you are a civil rights worker and your work is needed, because without it, we're not gonna get where we need to go.
Man, there's so much to think about and so much to say, but I guess I'll try to tie it up this way. You know, if you ever heard of someone named Kitty Genovese, back in 1964 in Queens, this was a person that was walking to her apartment and got brutalized. And while she was being brutalized by this attacker, she screamed for help constantly to the top of her lungs, right? The person got in their car, drove away, came back 10 minutes later, continued to brutalize her again while she was screaming to the top of her lungs. And when it was all said and done and the police started asking questions, they found about 40 witnesses that said that they heard these screams, and yet no one was really doing anything about it. So this was like a phenomenon, and they tried to figure out what could possibly happen where 40 people are hearing this and no one's intervening. And these sociologists came to town to try to figure it out because it was just so weird and complex. And they came up with the term diffusion of responsibility. And the reason why I point that out, and it's also called bystander syndrome, is because, you know, I guess I'd be remiss to not say that in this room full of people that actually took time out of their day to discuss civil rights, you know, just make sure that you're not a bystander. Every time we go outside, we see people in tents, and these are silent cries for help that we're seeing. We're seeing so much going on, and if we're not doing anything to intervene at some of these travesties that we're seeing, you know, we're no better than anybody else. So it's not everybody else's responsibility, it's all of our responsibility.
Amen.
Well, my thought is very similar to that. As I'm thinking about everything going on today, it reminds me of a quote from Coretta Scott King, and she says that freedom has to be fought for in every generation. And we've witnessed this even more recently when we move a little bit forward. Those who are in disagreement with us moving forward swing back with a lot of might. And so when we think about civil rights, it is about holding the line. It is that we are all civil rights workers and that we can't be bystanders. We have to be active in making sure that we're not just holding the line, but pushing the line forward and then preparing our youth and our up and coming generations to be prepared to fight as well, because there will still be a fight. Unfortunately, people are not perfect. One day I hope we can get to a point where discrimination doesn't exist, but for the foreseeable future, we exist in the space that we exist in now. But moments like this, events like this, give me so much hope that we're in a beautiful, diverse room of people that want to learn about how we can make our community as safe and as equitable and inclusive as possible.
Well, I want to close by thanking you. I wanted to talk about housing complex, not too far from here in San Francisco. We represented a tenant there and who had lived at this complex for over 40 years with his mom. And his mom tragically passed during COVID. He had filed an application with the property manager to be added on the lease of this home that he lived in his whole life. And they had lost the application or somehow just never processed it. And so when his mother died, the next month they moved to evict him. Now they never, despite the fact that he paid rent on time, now they never actually served him with the eviction. The property manager's son supposedly served him, but he never got notice of it. He didn't learn about the eviction until he went to make a work order, and they said, oh, we can't accept your work orders anymore. And he said, well, why not? He says, oh, sorry, you've been evicted. And, and by that point, he'd already lost by default on his, he'd already sort of gotten a default judgment. So one, it's crazy to think that tenants can go through an eviction process unrepresented and that we can somehow have fair outcomes, but that is the reality for most of California and the rest of the country. And second, it's a good example of how discrimination, I think, works right now, because this particular complex has seen the Black population decrease by 40% over a 15-year period, and our client was Black. And it's an example of like these little actions, like refusing to process a change in the lease that kind of add up to displacement and loss of wealth. Fortunately, we kind of have the tools to address it, but the problem is enforcement and the inability to enforcement because there aren't, I think, enough legal aid lawyers. So that's how I'll end.
I want to thank you all for your hard work, for advocating for low-income people, for not being bystanders, and for being civil rights workers. And that really goes for all of you. You're all working in housing in some area or another. And keep flying the flag, you know? Keep moving forward, right?